What's up, dog, everybody? This is Torrential Downfall, and the topic of discussion today is self-harm. Self-harm is a difficult topic, but it's something that many people around the world experience. So, thought it could be good to start a discussion on it, and maybe something you can carry on with the ones you love. Self-harm means intentionally causing pain or injury to yourself, usually as a way of coping with difficult emotions or situations. In 2021, it's estimated 5.5 million people committed self-harm, and that's expected to double by 2040. Young people, especially those aged 15 to 24, bear the heaviest burden of self-harm. Scarily, there are reported instances of children as young as 10 hurting themselves, and hospital admissions from self-harm are increasing, even leading to death. Research shows that adolescent girls are more likely to attempt self-harm, while adolescent boys are more likely to die from self-inflicted injuries. Groups at increased risk of self-harm include people with a history of trauma, abuse, depression, anxiety or bullying, as well as those who identify as LGBTQIA+. Social stigma and lack of support can make it harder for those individuals to seek help. However, self-harm isn't limited to any one group, and it can really affect people from any background. Am I an expert on this topic? Not at all. I'm nobody you need to believe about this. However, if you see my previous video where I had a friend on the topic of depression, I do have another friend. That would make two friends that I have. And yeah, again, she's, this one's totally real as well. But she's someone who does self-harm and has kindly offered to give some insight into the topic. So I asked her to begin with, what does self-harm mean to you? And she made an interesting point that I'd not considered. To begin with, she explained self-harm isn't just, I'm going to cut myself. Overeating and harming your health, chronic smoking, drug use and abuse, binge drinking, overwork, forcing yourself to miss out on sleep, even over-exercise, strain on your body from extreme lifting. These are all forms of self-harm. It's not just viewed that way in society. Most of these are just seen as hobbies, having fun, or the grind. And I said to her, wow, that does put an interesting perspective on self-harm, and maybe I'm not treating myself as well as I should be. And she said, yeah, and maybe consider putting the donut next time down, you fatty. I was like, wow, we're really going there today. I might be a little bit chubby, but that's because I got a sweet tooth, Anyways, getting off topic, maybe, stick to the point. She said, she's sorry. She thought about sugarcoating the point, but, she said I'd probably try and eat that. So, she'd stick to the self-harm topic and keep it as the physical act of abuse on your body. So I asked her, without hurting my feelings again, what makes you cut? What did you get from it? She said she liked the wording of the question, because even though she's doing the hurting to herself, she doesn't feel in control when she's hurting herself. She says she's an addict. Through work in therapy, she discovered it comes as an impulse reaction to feeling overwhelmed, experiencing so much emotion that she needs a release, which the cutting provides. She said cutting wasn't about feeling pain. It hurt, yes, but it was more about the release. Some people do hurt themselves because they feel they deserve it. They want to feel that pain, which, does need to be worked on with a mentality change. However, in her case, it's more about emotional regulation and not being able to handle those overwhelming feelings. And I asked her, what stops you from expressing how you feel? And she talked about not being understood by her friends, her family, society in general. There's so much that she wanted to talk about, but truly no one there for her to talk about it. So cutting helps her to resolve the build up of emotions. I looked at her, with a bit of sadness in my eyes, to be honest. And then I noticed something quite weird. I told her, I don't see any cuts on your wrists, so what happened? Did they disappear over time? And she said, that's well observed, but not everybody cuts themselves on their wrists. The wrist is an easily visible spot, and often when someone cuts, if they've been influenced by dark media where cutting your wrist is popularized, that's something they'll do. Or they cut their wrists because it's a cry for help of not being okay. She specifically cuts where nobody could see it, because it's nobody's business but hers. And it's something that I hadn't noticed because it's not a visible spot. And she said, you only know about it because I told you. And then I asked her what I thought was a difficult question but an important one. And I asked her, are you still cutting now, or what stopped you, and what advice can you give? She paused, needed a moment to compose herself, and she was brutally honest. She said no, she's not cutting anymore. However, like an addiction, she thinks about it every single day. If she gets stressed or overwhelmed, it's the first thing that comes to mind. However, during therapy, there was a key moment that changed her perspective on cutting. Her therapist asked her if she had a partner, theoretically speaking, and the partner saw that she had cuts on her body, how would that make her feel? She realised it would make her really sad, and whether it's alcoholism, drug abuse, cutting, or any kind of self-harm, she doesn't want to be with a partner who's putting themselves through something like that. So to be the kind of person she wanted to date, she decided to stop cutting. Other people may have different reasons why they want to stop cutting. When it comes to advice on self-harm, a good way to look at it is, if your partner or your child was doing the things that you're doing to yourself, would you want them to stop? And on a separate note, if the act of cutting is a cry for help, can you reach out to anyone, whether it be personal or professional? Or can you swap the habit with something else for that stress release? A simple transition could be, instead of cutting yourself, taking a rubber band to your wrist and pulling at it when you'd want to cut instead of actually cutting yourself. It's similar to swapping nicotine gum instead of cigarettes. Obviously, it's not the same, but it's a good transition. Or can you find another hobby that you can use as a release, whether that be drawing, writing, watching a movie, something to help you release those emotions that you're feeling inside. And I told her, your body is a temple, and even if your hands break down those walls, you can still use those same hands to build the foundations of a bigger, stronger building. Learning to love yourself more than you hurt yourself. She smiled and said that was a lovely thought. Me thinking that we'd connected as more than friends. Yes, I'm doing this for the second time. This time with a different girl. I went in for a kiss. She pushed me away and said, "Ooh, get your filthy trotters off me, you dirty, obese pig. If you ever have another YouTube idea, maybe we'll talk again." Yeah. And that ended another friendship. But in conclusion, self-harm, though primarily seen as a physical abuse to yourself, can come in many forms like binge drinking and overeating. Therapy can help you to understand why you harm yourself, but it might also be helpful to try and swap those harmful practices for something that's more caring to yourself. Thank you for watching, and remember, as long as it hurts no one, you know, do something nice for yourself today. Bye-bye.